Since I have yet to do this in any kind of constructive way in one place that's easily accessible or seen, I figured I'd just lay out a sort of roadmap for 2023, early 2024, so that you know what projects are coming down the pipe, what to expect. I have plotted out 12 short stories that I'll release on a month-by-month basis moving into 2024, horror short stories once a month. So that's kind of the quota to meet. The fantasy novel, He Who Thunders, will come out in July and early August. Probably in a sequential format very similar to Awakening, though it might take a little longer because it's a slightly longer book. In December, I have Delve, the novel to kind of wrap up the Delve cycle about subterranean hominids coming up. I finally have a good enough idea and a plot that I think will be impressive and good enough to kind of cover all the themes that I want to cover with a culminating story in that cycle. In October, I'm thinking of this year, I'm thinking I'm going to tackle one of Lovecraft's unfinished fragments or something from his dream journal and try to expand it into a plotted short story. I'm sure I won't have the acumen and the capacity to do as good a job as he might have done had he lived longer, but I think that would serve as an interesting sort of writing prompt. So it should be a relatively interesting year. I'm going to try to be a little bit more regular as much as life allows in putting things out. A little bit more predictable. Still won't be exact dates, but a little bit more predictable. And hopefully you enjoy what's coming on the horizon. Redding's Holler. I remember the day Dalton Redding died. The strange old soul had been a staple of Breathitt County life since well before my time. But to understand the depth of Redding's hold on the psyche of such a small, interconnected community, one needs to begin, funnily enough, at the beginning. That isn't to say we start where I come into the story. Not at all. We begin, rather, when Breathitt County was first settled by Europeans some 300 years ago. The crags and slopes of the hollers in the region that was to become Breathitt County made it a less than inviting place. The trees dumped pine needles so thick they sullied the ground beneath their heavy boughs with the acid sting of sap and resin, leaving the dirt infertile for years after tracts along the river were cleared away. The rolling emerald ocean of hills is so steep that wind seems never to touch the valleys, and even today, the runoff is so fierce in storms that the Kentucky River slips its banks and ravages the lowland farms once or twice a year. But the poor and brave are prone to risk, and the early settlers of Breathitt were no exception. The first families, carrying names like Noble, Haddocks, Combs, Turner, and Watts, came in from the east around 1780, while the Revolution still raged. They were just poor and young enough to feel they had little to lose and everything to gain coming out into unsettled territory, and, perhaps, wished to avoid the ongoing conflict by slipping off into unspoiled land unfrequented by natives or Europeans. They cobbled together sturdy but temporary cabins of a strange sort, built by walling in the rock overhangs that crowd the river basin in the region, and dwelt in the warm, dry cubbies beneath the stone until farms and houses could be erected in the coming years. Even then, when swine and scant crops seeded out along the valley floors were beginning to flow back east into civilization, young Breathitt County remained an isolated and seldom trafficked place, and with the rail service and the logging industry not reaching the area for the better part of a century, it was to remain that way for a long, long time. But in that second summer, spent carving out a livelihood in the rugged hills of what would one day become Kentucky, the intrepid families found they were not, in fact, alone on their newly claimed territory. True, a few Shawnee hunting parties came through now and again, and relations were tense and often violent. But there was another, more permanent resident in the valleys off the northern fork of the Kentucky River, and he was no Indian. Arnold Haddix, one of the few newcomers in Breathitt with a good command of letters, records that he and a few men of the Noble family were out on a hunt in July of 1781. They had followed a wounded elk's blood trail up from the riverside, and had come into a dark and tightly wooded upland holler made almost unnavigable by thick patches of thorned blackberries. They grew excited, for the wild berries were so plentiful that, when they came into season in a month or so's time, they might prove a boon to the struggling food supply. There were pigs amidst the brush, hairy and perhaps wild, who snorted and brayed at the interlopers like nervous dogs. Then, the elk trail led them to a dark, marshy clearing near a freshwater spring at the basin of the valley, which was alive with the song of bullfrogs. At the center of this small swamp, they discovered a well-kept old house in the earliest colonial style common to some areas of distant New England. Its color and grandeur had faded with time despite the strong structure of the home, giving the impression it had stood there in the shadows of the wood for many decades, and upon its stoop sat a lean old man, taller than any of the hunters and with a beard so long he could have tucked it into his belt. While all the hunters were, of course, armed, they tread carefully through the conversation that followed. There was something keen as a hawk about the old man, and though they outnumbered him, and the ancient firearm strewn at his side on the stoop was outclassed many times over by their own arms, they were on his land now, and felt the pall of the dark woods and the strange house grow chill and sharp beneath the ancient's icy eyes. He introduced himself as Dunland Redding. He asked whether they were chasing a wounded elk, and upon receiving an affirmative answer, he told them it had run past the house into the deeper briars beyond. Redding then told them they should aim more carefully, and that he did not like strangers coming onto his land uninvited. His tone was cool and calm, but his words carried an unspoken threat in them that seemed to shake Haddix and the other hunters so violently they left the clearing, and their lost prey, be without apology or question. The settlers left the strange old man alone, and would see Dunland Redding only occasionally over the next few years, the occasions growing more and more sparse as the 19th century dawned. Redding stuck fast to his unseen house in the upland holler, and never came down save to chase escaped pigs from his small pen, and take moonlit walks in the dead of bright nights along the wildest spans of the riverside. He was spry and agile for a man so old, and seemed to scale hills and climb rocks to harvest the wild blackberry groves he tended with the unnatural vigor of a much younger soul. On one occasion in 1803, recalled avidly in local folklore, a woman from the newborn town of Jackson stumbled across him in the woods close to dusk as she returned to her home. Feeling obliged to make the awkward meeting less frigid through friendly conversation, she asked him earnestly how long he had lived in the region. Dunland Redding told her his grandfather had built the old house he occupied in the hills, and that he'd been born there, as had his father before him, though Dunland had lost track of the years after his own father had passed. She wanted to ask if they'd come there alone, how they'd managed with no neighbors or fellow settlers to lean on in times of hardship, but she thought better of it and made to leave. She claimed Redding's eyes glinted in the fiery gleam of dusk like embers of a fierce fire that might burst into life with the right fuel thrown on, and she no longer felt safe standing there before him on the dimming eaves of the woods. This tale about the Reddings having been a staple of the region grew ever more popular as time marched on, for in 1852, after nearly 40 years of no contact between the burgeoning town of Jackson and the hermit of Breathitt County, something singularly odd occurred, something which colored the perceptions of the region for years to come. Though the folk of Breathitt County, through all their feuds and struggles, avoided Redding's Holler out of sheer aversion all those years, they'd ever heard the shrill whine of the hermit's pigs and seen the new shipments brought in each spring. They'd seen the gleam of fires through distant trees, and seen stars wink in the navy sky on nights when the drums, always more drums than one man might wield, it was said, started up in the blackberry groves, where none dared tread. The frog song which echoed down from the marsh around his cottage was so loud on still nights that it could be heard down in the town, and distinguished itself from the night calls of other amphibians by the strange, almost linguistic notes it carried. They whispered about how old Redding must be, for he'd seemed 70 or 80 in the 1700s when the first settlers had arrived. But that something in 1852 brought an end to the lack of sightings, and to whatever small comforts the people of Jackson had dreamed up to explain away their worries. It was a clear autumn night, and a lone falling star streaked into the Kentucky River just after sunset. When a couple curious youths from town went upriver to see if they might find it, they did indeed discover it, a sterling orb of silver which caught the striking moonlight. It was cradled in the sinewy arm of an ancient man in rags who introduced himself as Danforth Redding, son, so he said, to Dunland Redding. In his other arm he cradled a placid frog so large it rivaled a small dog. The youths, like the hunters and the wandering woman almost a century prior, were so taken aback by the man's eyes and alien demeanor that they didn't quiz him about what he meant to do with the fallen star, or worry about the price the lunar metal might fetch in Lexington or Louisville. Instead, they made their nervous goodbyes and skulked back into town through the dark, leaping at every snapped branch and bout of droning frog song all the while. The whole trip home was scored by the shrilling of distant pigs and Redding's Holler, and drums which never ceased to beat their doldrum drone against the silence of a frightened forest. Then the real talk began, about how, other than carts of fresh young pigs, no supply or provender ever trickled up into Redding's Holler. How would the elder Redding have met and married a wife? Why had the small family never been seen down in Jackson, to have an illness seen to or pick up supplies? How many might be up there in that once glimpsed northern home, which must now be falling to pieces under the onslaught of years? People speculate in the absence of hard facts, and this is doubly true in Appalachia, where, especially in that age, to be taken unawares might mean death. The answer the most imaginative in town gave was that the elder Redding hadn't been married at all. Perhaps that earlier encounter with the unnamed woman on the outskirts of Jackson had been laced with lies, too. Perhaps Dunland and Danforth Redding were the same man, preserved by some ritual or alchemy, and allowed to escape the notice of his nervous neighbors through his own reclusiveness and shadowy reputation. The keening pigs and the strange rhythms and the titanic amphibious croaking in Redding's remote corner of the hills lent much credence to this idea, and even the most somber souls in town who dismissed such superstitions continued to urge their children and kinfolk never to near Redding's lonely Holler. Another tale came later on during the Civil War, when government men swept into Breathitt looking for volunteers to send south into Tennessee under the Union banner. More draft men were sent home in coffins than returned with fresh recruits, so the search didn't last long in that portion of Kentucky. Just long enough for one of the Federals to write home about an unsettling experience he'd had in a place the locals called Redding's Holler. The draft man told about how he'd visited Danforth Redding's old house in the briar-shrouded marsh late in the afternoon, and all but forced his way inside upon hearing the towering hermit himself declare there weren't any young men on the property. The draft man quickly learned Redding was right. He lived alone, and the tottering old structure he dwelt in showed no signs any guest save himself had ever lurked there. But the draft man was a proud university graduate from the coast, and the moldering books which lined the sagging shelves of Redding's surprisingly sprawling library gave him pause when he attempted to peruse them and strike up a friendly conversation. There were countless histories of New England and Old Europe, but these were the tamest of the volumes. More wicked tomes were dispersed amongst them, many of which caught the draft man's jittery eyes. The supposedly prehistoric Book of Eibon, bequeathed to students of the strange from fabled Hyperborea, was cracked on a moldy end table as if it were light Sunday reading. An original German printing of von Junst's nameless cults was on the shelves next to an equally ancient handwritten copy of De Vermis Mysteris in its original Latin. A vast diagram of formulae having something to do with the creation of homunculi covered the wall beside the stained fireplace, and the books beneath it were all medieval tomes on anatomy and Latinized Kabbalah. Most disgusting of all these books of witchery and the odd, said he, was a gigantic volume bound in what he took to be ratty old pigskin, of something called the Parchments of Nam. The cover was inlaid with a horrid ink depiction of a gigantic corpulent toad with goatish eyes, and weeping sores slickening its fetid skin. He made to go, a combination of the dark literature and his host's glare convincing him he'd overstayed his welcome. It was almost dark, and the draft man said the bullfrogs around the hermit's home bellowed so loud it set his ears to ringing, as cannon fire might do. Pigs screamed farther off in the briar-choked forest that flanked the marsh, lending the whole place an evil air. He reached the barely visible path out in the dusky dim, and made it perhaps halfway out of Redding's Holler beneath the blackness of the forest canopy before the frog song died away enough to allow him to perceive the footsteps which followed him along the trail. A chase ensued, for whenever the draft man picked up the pace, the footsteps responded in kind. There were many of them, these unseen pursuers, and they split briars and broke branches as if they were a band of men on the hunt. But aside from the moans and croaks of frogs and the shrill whine of pigs, he could hear no shouts or human speech. Twice he stumbled in the near blackness of the deep woods, and once a wet hand or arm scraped along his back in the clamor, reaching, he could only guess, at that which had sought for prey. When, at last, he stumbled out onto the more trafficked dirt roads into Jackson, his pursuers had stopped, and he was left to sprint the rest of his route into town alone. He pinned his frightened letter to family soon after, then left the moment the other draft men abdicated Breathitt County. But the party of retreating Federals lost track of him somewhere on the road west after a fierce rain overtook them, and they had to strike up an early camp in the dense woods along the riverbank on the Lee County border. There was a fierce wind that night, and the downpour prevented the lighting of a fire. The horses were straining at their tethers in the trees, and the banks were alive with the noises of frogs. One among the ranks swore he'd heard chanting in all that calamity, something almost unpronounceable laced with repetitions of the equally strange word, Tsathagwa. Whatever the truth of that claim, when morning broke and the storm subsided, they found the draft man who'd snooped in Redding's Holler missing, his tent empty and trampled in the muck. They sent word to the sheriff back in Jackson, but he assumed it was the swollen river that had swept the unfortunate soul away, and refused to promise more than a search of the muddy Kentucky's North Fork, which, as one might expect, turned up nothing. The Federals went home, and the townsfolk of Jackson had another reason to steer well clear of Redding's upland home. Years later, after the war ended, it had come to light that 2 travelers from the coast were in town. They were the 2 brothers of the missing draft men. They claimed they'd traced a Redding who'd fled from the early frontier in Vermont sometime in the 1600s under accusations of witchcraft and murder, and suspected the descendants of that family might now be holed up in Kentucky. The townsfolk attempted to dissuade them from venturing up into Redding's Holler to question the old man, but they would not be denied, and were never seen again after taking the branch road up into the briars. Some in the neighboring mountains claimed to have heard screams or drums the night after, but nothing substantive came of the claims, as much because the lawmen in town wouldn't risk a trip into the Holler to search as because of any dearth of evidence, and the hills fell back into their characteristic rhythms once more. Aside from the occasional sighting of Redding walking the riverbank alone under full moons, that marked the last major sighting of him until 1902, when he would appear during the famed Hargis-Cockrell feud that helped the county earn the name of Bloody Breathitt. It was July, and there had just been a minor ambush by Cockrells along the Riverside Road into Jackson on a group of Hargis men. None were fatally hit in the shootout, but it scattered the Hargis faction to the four winds, and a pair of Callahan brothers, a family allied to the Hargis faction in the feud, ended up fleeing through the thickets uphill into a frighteningly thick stand of blackberry briars, where pigs and frogs scored the wilderland. A trio of their pursuers, realizing where the Callahans had gone, picked out positions around the edge of Redding's hated Holler and awaited a sign that their foes would flee the feared place. So dark were the woods in that place, and so awful was the fetid air given off by the strange little spring-fed marsh around Redding's old house, that they expected no man would brave the Holler for long. But the Callahan boys never came out. Rather, there went a flurry of gunfire down in the marshy valley, followed by a terrible scream the likes of which the trio of hunting cockerel men had never heard before. Squeals and hoarse, groaning croaks swelled in the dark down there, and the surviving feudists went home praying they'd gone unnoticed by whatever hateful power protected twisted old Redding's domain. As the 1900s wore on and the region grew more tame, Redding was glimpsed less and less, but he was there all the same. Strange, abnormal figures were glimpsed now and then beneath the trees along Redding's ridge at dusk, and the wild game still steered clear of the tempting groves of blackberry vines. A chance encounter with a frightened walker along the Riverside Road near dark in 1927 furnished the news that Dalton Redding was the new ruler of Redding's Holler, though, as usual, his features and ancient, almost British early New England accent marked him as uncannily similar to his supposed father. This now canned explanation for Redding's unnatural longevity was mocked in private by the local folk who knew well enough to fear him, but still none risked the woods around Redding's Holler, and children shivered in their beds on solstices, when the rolling mountains of the county echoed with the malign chorus of toads and screaming pigs, and drums shook the windows of aged cabins in the trees. Redding was a boogeyman to the locals when I was a child in the late 50s and 60s. His odd, seemingly ritualistic bacchanals, conducted supposedly by a single man, were his sole contact with the outside world for years at a time now, and they left the county uneasy whenever they wakened nervous residents in Jackson. It is a testament to the fear Redding inspired in the locals that the old man was not discreetly taken care of by an armed posse or neighboring family at any point during his long reign in Breathitt, and that reputation kept even the most raucous of us boys out of his briar-choked fortress of solitude. Come the December of 1978, I had been out of the state for several years attending college in West Virginia. Barring visits home on breaks, I had breathed the fresh air further east and cleared a great deal of the mysticism and legendary of Breathitt from the forefront of my mind. I was too caught up in my own pursuits to dwell on the shadowy myths that lurked beneath the boughs back home, and thus, when a relative fell ill early into my Christmas vacation and I was called home, I didn't think twice about beginning my sojourn back to Kentucky late in the afternoon. I entered the county just before midnight, and found myself driving through one of the largest thunderstorms to hit the region in decades. Floods, so common to the area during downpours, had begun in the lowland valleys as swollen streams dumped their contents into the Kentucky River, and as I swerved along back roads by the gleam of dim headlights against the drumming onslaught of rain, I came up against more than one sign proclaiming roads closed. This, at length, forced me onto a one-lane gravel track that skirted the edge of a steep and ungainly slope, half remembered from my teenage rambles around town. No houses, no driveways, no lights, just untamed woods and hunting plots in the most rugged part of the hills. I hoped the little track would link me back up with familiar routes, for I was only a few miles from the family house then, but that was not to be. Nervous at the low visibility, made all the worse by the jungle-like canopy that strangled what little ambient moonlight might have penetrated the dire clouds overhead, I took a turn too fast in soupy gravel made marshy by pooling rain, and slid slow from the road onto a slope. My car fortunately did not roll, and I sustained no injuries, for the slide was slow. But at its end, I found my battered old car tangled in trunks a good 20 yards downhill from the gravel, and fast realized I wouldn't be getting it out that night. I had a weak flashlight and a gas station road map in the glove box, a lighter in my pocket, and had worn a jacket for the ride, but that was almost all I had going for me. I had the pack I took on hunting trips out in West Virginia in the trunk, but aside from my compass and some knives and rope, it was empty this far removed from my regular hunting seasons. While I sat in the car under the drumming rain pondering my situation, I discovered, based on a perusal of the map, that the gravel road I was on would wind almost back to the riverside at its end, and at length decided it would be faster to cut north from the road across 2 small hollers in the dark, and reach the paved rural route that my house sat on not far off. It should, even in the dark, be impossible to miss that road, given it hemmed in the valleys I'd be crossing on 3 sides. So long as I minded the compass and kept my wits about me, I would be home, and warm, in a couple hours' time at most. Gathering up what I had and flicking on the light, I figured I'd traipse down the hill into the depths and see what I could see by the yellowish glow. I was only halfway down the slope, slipping and sliding in the mud and carefully avoiding the rocky crags and ledges so ubiquitous to this span of the mountains, when I realized how silent the woods around me were. The rain, though trickling down from the roof of leaves and needles overhead, was muted, and amidst that half-silence, I perceived no wind-shaken foliage or animal sounds in the hectic night. I wrote this off as a quiet born of the ferocity of the storm, but that rationalizing didn't stop my heart from quickening as old, awful stories told to me in childhood about forbidden hollers and strange happenings shoved to the fore of my memory. When I reached relatively level ground at the bottom of the slope, and found myself in a thicket of blackberry brambles so dense the going became sluggish, those fears could not be pushed aside. The briars, the runoff, the cave-like dark. It was all too familiar. I knew where I must be, the holler having ever been unlabeled on maps and my unfamiliarity with the gravel track having sent me stumbling right into the belly of a nightmare. I attempted a crawl back up the slope I'd descended, but the cool muck and wet leaves made a blind scramble impossible, and as the minutes ticked by and my soaked shoes grated on my heels, I resolved to cross the holler, telling myself I was a fool for dwelling on old wives' tales and torrid small-town legends. I kept the light forward, and my compass readied, and my ears keen as I picked my way cautiously through brambles en route to the paved road some 2 miles off. Unbeknownst to me then, but known well to me now, the previous days in town had been eventful as it concerned Dalton Redding. Blind as I was wandering into the belly of it all, a great clap of thunder and column of lightning had come down out of a clear afternoon sky 2 days before, their target seemingly the isolated center of Redding's Holler. The drums and chanting and animal cries came back that night, louder than ever, and more than a few people in Jackson stayed up through the night watching the clouds which streaked the sky. They seemed to swirl and coagulate with a frightening sentience, forming a sort of celestial whirlpool above the marsh in the hated upland valley. The townspeople of Jackson had seen Redding sprint into town on foot in the stark light of the following morning, dressed in tattered clothing about 3 centuries out of fashion, and carrying under one arm a swollen frog the size of a small canine that matched perfectly descriptions from local legend. He had been buying ammunition with chunks of what no one could deny was solid gold, and babbled to himself as he bounced from store to store about how it wasn't the end, and they'd be back tonight. Some, however, claimed he was not so much talking to himself as to his frog, which had emerald eyes that struck many onlookers as almost human, and seemed to nod and fidget in time with the ancient's ramblings. There was talk of having the old man detained and looked at by a medical professional, but before the law could be convinced to act, Dalton Redding had disappeared back into the hills and made for his holdfast with a hulking sack of buckshot over one shoulder. He left an interesting relic on the counter of an old general store along Main Street, a journal, it seemed, written wholly in Latin. Though the townsfolk wouldn't have it translated until much later, its contents shed an uncomfortable amount of light on what I walked into that soggy December night. It was recorded in short, sentence-long bursts, and while most of it was arcane mantra and lists of reagents and ingredients for obscure concoctions the man planned to make, the final span of entries were much more focused. I will record them here, having retrieved them from a family friend who still possesses a handwritten English rendition of the text. The original, along with all Redding's belongings, was eventually burned by a relieved and exhausted town which considered itself fortunate to be rid of him. To the best of my estimation, the record of preparations for his final ritual, though entries are undated, begins around the 1st of December, is continued at sparse intervals thereafter, and ends the night before his unprecedented flight into town for supplies. The cleansing has not been fully prepared, but the thing that dreams below is stirring. If I'm to keep him asleep, I must hurry. Lord Tsathoggua has warned me he is not ready for the cleansing. I have never heard him so nervous. My familiar is also uneasy. I cannot allow this to happen, though. I must hurry. Tsathoggua, honored sleeper of Nakai, has finally armed me with the words I need, but he thinks I will fail. He knows and hates this dreamer, and it makes him uneasy. I will do my best to put the thing back beneath the veil of sleep. Familiar has alerted me to things in the swamp at night, things I did not raise up. Tsathoggua is silent, even when I've offered him swine at his pool. I am not finished with my work. The army I've bred for him is only 40 strong. It cannot stand against the dreamer. He must help me. The black toad is still silent. Familiar tells me we need to leave and re-establish ourselves elsewhere to continue the work, but I am not willing to abandon one of Tsathoggua's holy sites so readily. I will wait until the right moment, then offer all the pigs at the pool in one night, when the moon is right and the dreamer is stirring. I will need a shard of Tsathoggua here if I am to be successful. If the thing brings its minions up from below, we will be overwhelmed. It is coming. Tonight is the night. I knew it would come. From the very beginning I knew. I just never expected it to come so sudden. All these years in hiding and preparation, all these centuries brought to a halt so quickly. But I will try. Let the black toad sing. I have failed. The ritual has failed. Tsathoggua was too deep in his torpor to aid me. I am alone with the homunculi I have raised for him, but we will not be enough. The dreamer's kin will come up from the caves tonight. I will go into town and buy ammunition, but I know it to be foolish. I have told Familiar he is not needed, but he has elected to stay. I shall be gone come morning. If an initiate of the Black Toad should notice my absence and find this, burn it, and keep wary of the Elder Mountains. They will be the site of ruin before long. This was all, as I've said, illegible to the people of Jackson those first days on the ground, but they realized something was happening with or without the jotted journal. Gunfire and the uproar of frogs scored the night after Redding's harried visit, lasting fully from sundown to sunup. The drums and chanting were gone now, as were the squeals of pigs, ostensibly all killed during whatever ritual Redding was planning the night before. But some of the loudest and most resonant notes in the frog song were deep and rumbling, and reminded the oldest in Breathitt of stories told by grandparents and great-grandparents about the feud disappearances. After dawn, all was silent, and by the time the storm rolled in that afternoon, a veiled hush had devoured Redding's Holler. Thus, I walked on in ignorance, half fueled by youthful illusions of invincibility and half by the hazy focus brought on by sudden trauma and dire circumstance. The danger seemed to wax and wane like a guttering candle flame to me then, devoured as I was by minute focus on making my way in the dark and avoiding the most gnarled strands of dried winter bramble. It was only when I stumbled into a marshy pool and realized I was out in the open being pelted by the rain that I saw the house, and the impending sense of doom crashed back down upon me. The house was worse than any vivid picture painted by old tales could provide. It was all the more ancient now, its walls stripped barren and leaning. A wing of it had lost its roof and been abandoned by its resident. It was dark, and no lantern or candlelight burned within the ancient structure, much less the buzzing gleam of electric, which had never been run into Redding's Holler. Nor did smoke issue from the slumped chimney, cold as it was. I had approached from the rear, and I could see the back door was open, broken in and shattered by the looks of it through the intervening gloom. I froze and listened for a long while, attempting to determine what I was searching the air for even as I did so. But eventually, it hit me. There were no frogs singing in the marsh, and the world around me was ruled wholly by the torrential rain. It took me some minutes to build up the courage to press on across the open muck towards the house. I was caught between the desire to stray around the clearing and cut across it, but the slow going through the brambles and the silence of the glen convinced me I should opt for speed more than discretion, and it was quicker by far to take the mire than to stick to the blackberry thicket. I must confess, though, that I was overcome by a sort of suicidal curiosity as well, drowned in the sensation that I was both alone and in the company of legends no one in Breathitt had ever truly seen or understood. My first fright came about halfway to the house. I stumbled upon the edge of a small pond in the dark, my eyes having been locked on the yawning back doorway across the span rather than the ground beneath my feet. I almost stumbled down into the muck, but I caught myself. Only then did I turn the light on the water and see the weird forms floating dead there. There were many of them, dozens at least. They were a little shorter than a man and sturdily built, but their limbs were oblong and fluid like tendrils, and their forms seemed almost boneless. Their slick skin was a green that bordered on white, and was shot through by purple veins that bulged even now in the stillness of death. They had no heads, just single bulbous orbs or eyes like blackened egg yolks set into the broad torsos. These sat above impossibly wide mouths or orifices without teeth, often hanging open and filled with the murky water of the pool in which they'd been slain. Their rubbery flesh was often ripped and torn, and the pond was dark with their spilled blood. I could not know then, but as I stumbled up onto the pond's bank and made to skirt the edge in trembling shock at what I was seeing, I was looking upon Redding's creations. I suppose I can't even know that now, but given the local legendary, and all that the parties which followed me into that glen later dug up before burning the place to the ground, it is impossible for me to dismiss that belief. These were his twisted homunculi, bred perhaps from the eggs of the frogs of Redding's Hollow. Horrible as they were to look upon, especially like that, half-cloaked in blackness and bloated with a day's rot, I cannot help but feel their defeat was a disaster. They'd been bred as guard dogs of a kind, a shield for whatever black toad Redding believed communed with him through the pond behind his home. Whatever killed them was, by Redding's reckoning, far worse, and if they were enough to scare strange and fierce old Dalton, or Dunland or Danforth Redding, they must be terrible indeed. I did not, thank God, see this black toad, this Tsathoggua, in the water that night. I doubt, based on what Redding wrote, the god thing was ever truly in the pool. It was merely a shrine, an altar, a holy place through which he could connect with the thing from beyond that he served. But its shadow seemed to hang heavy over the pool even then, when I knew nothing of Redding's beliefs or writings or doings in the lonely dark of the Holler, and I hurried to leave that awful place. Rounding the pond brought me within a few yards of the back door, though, and much as I tried not to look inside, I could not help myself as I slogged past in the dark. I never slowed my pace, never stopped to poke my head inside and slake my morbid curiosity. That sidelong shine of the flashlight through that awful doorframe did more than enough to break me. The first thing I saw was the corpse a few feet back from the precipice, near flattened and rent almost to pieces. A shattered shotgun lay to the side, its presence giving the impression of a final stand gone awry. The corpse was more a stain than a man now, but I couldn't help but believe I knew exactly who it was. Who else would die there on the cusp of a house so singularly linked to a lonely, isolated man? Bad as that was, it was the outline of the thing that loomed over him which did in my mind and sent me screaming into the wood, my shoes sucked off in the mud and forgotten until I crawled bloody and breathless into my family house hours later. I learned the next day during the scouring of Redding's house that it was an effigy or totem of some kind, but that was not my impression then. In the jittery half-light, it seemed almost to move and loom in the dark, to surge forward in wrath at an intruder arrived to gawk in its hour of humiliation. Through all the wondering worry that filled my days until the elders in town decided the place and its inhabitants should be leveled and reduced to be forgotten by the march of years, I could not shake the feeling that the effigy had been alive. It was, in brief, something which should not exist. Something so aesthetically strange that its mere presence seemed an insult to a sane world. It was huge and slumped, its squat head pressed up against the wood of the moldering roof. Its many eyes, formed of some sterling silver, caught the glow of my light. Though it had the cradled girth and flabby bulk of a toad, it boasted countless long and spindly arms, almost sloth-like, whose claws clasped like the hands of a monk before its chest. Though carven, it was almost textured, hairy, but with the coat more of needles than of fur. Those awful eyes seemed to haunt me all the way home. Indeed, they haunt me still. But the true haunting thought, now that Redding is dead, and the county is at relative peace for perhaps the first time in its long and bloody history, is much more terrible. What in the good earth were mad old Redding and his black-toed god thing trying to contain?